Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We are glad you are all here today, and we are thrilled that Dr. Gabe Starbeck-Miller is with us today for our career development series. Today we are going to talk, well, Gabe's going to talk about the insights on drug discovery and development careers in the biotech industry. Dr. Gabriel Starbeck-Miller received his PhD in immunology here at the University of Iowa in 2014. During his graduate school training, Gabe was mentored by John Hardy as he studied the influence of cytokines on CD8 T cell responses. He then went on to Genentech for postdoctoral fellowship in Andrew Chan's lab, where he studied how TCR signaling can be governed differently in TH lineage specific contexts. In 2016, Gabe joined AbbVie as a senior scientist, where he further broadened his immuno-oncology experience and drug hunting skills as he explored novel ways myeloid cells can guide anti-tumor immune responses. In 2019, Gabe joined Pfizer, where he now mentors a group of PhD and non-PhD scientists as they develop new large molecule, small molecule, and mRNA-based therapies that aim to improve the immunogenicity of tumor cells and bring better outcome to cancer patients. So that is the probably short background on Gabe. He'll give you a little bit of a longer background of how he got into his career. And I'll ask him a few questions just to get started. But trainees, I would ask that if you've got questions for him, to feel free to unmute your mic and show your camera so that he's not talking to a black box. But this is meant for you, so go ahead and ask away. But I will have a few questions ready as well. So, Gabe, thanks again for being
Hmm.
here.
No
And
problem.
let us know a little bit more about yourself and kind of how you got into your career.
Sure. Yeah. So I think probably like all of you, well, like all of you here, or most of you here, started in graduate school just really getting interested in discovery biology, really answering basic academic questions that you all are probably pursuing now or maybe pursuing in the near future. And really just following my nose kind of stepwise after that. I didn't really necessarily know I would eventually be leading a group here at Pfizer necessarily as the end. Well, at this point in my career, I just stepwise again was just interested in after graduate school beginning to understand, okay, how can I actually take these basic principles I've learned and started to figure out how to do research in, how can I actually move this to the clinic and help people rather than just mice, for instance. So and just kept doing that, going on to Genentech and eventually AbbVie, and just followed my nose for opportunities that made sense based on my interests at the time. Um, and so, yeah, there wasn't really any magic sauce to any of that. I think it was just really understanding kind of where maybe you want to grow or have an impact, and just kind of taking a stepwise approach to following that sort of trend or trajectory. So yeah, and I think in the industry too, it's obviously led me here to La Jolla in San Diego area with Pfizer. I think a lot of the times in these sort of trajectories of career paths, you probably will tend to go to either coast, East or West Coast, just because there's a lot more opportunities there. And so I think that's also what drew me further away from Iowa, unfortunately, on a geographical level. But yeah, that's just a little more flavor to my career path. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, maybe to get started with.
Can you describe kind of what your position is like there at Pfizer
Sure.
and kind of maybe go in a little bit
Yeah.
more in depth of what if folks on this call were to look at that type of job and career, what that would entail?
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So what I do right now is, like Megan said, I have a group of about 6 people, 4 directly reporting to me, that are a mix of PhDs. Um, well, my 4 reports do have PhDs. 2 of them are postdocs. 2 of them are full-time employees. And so right now in my group sits in a discovery space, and so that means that we're part of drug development scenario that is coming up with the ideas to kickstart portfolio programs that could eventually materialize into drugs maybe 5 or more years from now. So really at the ground floor for like figuring out what sort of areas does it make sense for us to invest in to create an oncology drug. So specifically, the type of oncology drugs we try to develop are ones that stimulate immune responses to cancer. There are more specific nuances to the exact modalities or types of drugs we do to do that, but that's kind of the general theme that we do. And so as I work with them, what I try and mentor the full-time employee PhD level folks to do is to use known clinical data sets and even publish academic data sets to figure out, where should we make the next bet for stimulating the right type of immune cells, either better or in new ways that we haven't done before that could hopefully give better outcomes to patients. So I really, it's hard to really envision how how it's going to pay off 5, 10, or more years from now, but that's where we kind of start. And then as we get an idea, we pitch it to the department to see if it's on strategy or within Pfizer's interest areas, and if it's accepted, then we'll continue as biology leads to really drive the basic biology questions that need to be answered to further increase our confidence in that drug strategy. And then if that seems to be positive, then we'll continue with those programs and keep pushing them further to development to eventually make a candidate molecule that can be tested in the clinic. And so, again, my team really starts at the very foundational part of this drug discovery process. And I really help mentor them to make sure they're asking the right questions and considering all the caveats and concerns with what their approach may bring. So it kind of fuels in different elements of basic science research, as well as thinking about how it's going to fit into a realistic drug development plan, if it's even possible to drug this sort of biology, or even if this type of biology is worth pursuing. So that's kind of what we do. And so I manage a lot of these folks, and they carry out a lot of the bench work. Some of them actually have their own reports as well. So I also help them figure out how to best mentor and manage their own reports, and which is a process that I think a lot of people learn on the fly. Like in academia, I think you just learn to manage as you go along, and that's kind of what I've done as well. And I'm trying to guide them through the process, at least through my experiences. So I would say like most of my time is spent on managing those reports and making sure they're on the right sort of paths with their certain projects or portfolio programs. And I also sit in on a lot of a lot of other meetings that are just other project teams that I interact with to help give them support and input on their sort of programs. And so I guess like another thing, how my team works with the broader scheme of Pfizer is we essentially represent the biological aspect, or we're the discipline leads for biology. So anytime that there's a program that we're trying to put into the portfolio, we're looked at as subject matter experts, or like the top people in this sort of area, to help advocate for that type of biology and help guide the biology experiments. And we then interact with these, what they call matrix style teams, that bring in discipline leads or experts in protein expression and design, and small molecule chemist support, and toxicity sort of experts, and all these sort of other disciplines that kind of work all together to help drive a project. So we're only one part of the machine that helps drive the drug development process. But again, it's rooted in like a more of a biological perspective.
Awesome. All right, trainees, what questions do you have for Gabe?
I'll take any question.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can go ahead. As a person transitioning from academia to industry, what skills would you look into the candidate that can directly translate to industry?
Yeah. If you want to make the jump now into industry, like into a full time role, not do it, because I guess you at like are you talking like from a graduate school level?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I think at the graduate school level, whether you're getting a master's or a PhD, I think more often the positions that you'll be looking for, the recruiters or the hiring managers are going to look to see if you have that expertise for that need that they have at that moment. They also want to see that you're productive during graduate school, whether that's evidence through publications, presentations, anything that can show that you're accomplished, you can finish a scientific story and do discovery work. At least as I would look at candidates, because that's kind of what I think about all the time. So I think, if you can produce publications and show that you've been successful in doing discovery work, that's great. Um, in terms of your skill sets specifically, I think, if I wanted someone who was a T cell biology expert because of a particular need, then I will look for people who have that specific skill set. So I think it becomes unfortunately, very specific and kind of luck of the draw in some regard for what openings there are and how well you may or may not match. It's kind of in that way, kind of, a roll of the dice. But I think ways you can boost um, your competitiveness is to branch out as much as you can. So whether it's at your graduate school training level, if you can be involved in many different types of biology projects, um, then that'll just give you better chances to be a fit for some specific need, right? Rather than just becoming a very narrowed, focused expert on one particular type of biology with one particular mechanism or something in mind. It'll be very hard to find a job that will fit that, right? So if you broaden your skill sets and experience across different biology disciplines or maybe interrelated ones, then that could give you some flexibility as you compete for these jobs. So that's at least on a biology level, right? And something I'm looking for. But there's many other jobs too in industry, right? Like there's these other folks who make proteins all the time, and these really novel modalities that like sometimes make your head spin trying to understand how to make them. And so, there are other opportunities in trying to make those new biologics. And if you have expertise in toxicities and stuff like that, then they may have a slightly different perspective. But I think for the most part, they're going to want to see that you have relevant experience, foremost. Um, and what was the other part I was going to say? And I think too, like the other thing to make sure when you're applying for these jobs, when you see, they want X, Y, Z skill set, use that same jargon. Even if you're not used to using the same words, but you're like, oh, that's basically what I do. Um, just make sure to copy and paste and sorts the exact words and terminology they use, because they are, again, very focused on looking for particular things that they're familiar with. And so if you can make it that more transparent to them that you have that skill set, then the better off you're going to be for getting that job. So those are some considerations. But I think with any job, especially outside of the discovery space I'm in, there will be slightly different perspectives on who's competitive or not.
That's
Do you have
very
any follow-ups to
helpful.
that?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. I
Hi.
have two questions actually. The first one, I was wondering that are there any kind of option in industry to make a collaboration or partnership with the academia that pursue some of our experiments, like our research in there, also like to
Yeah.
make a connection and like an internship to ease the transition to go to that, you know, the company or something like
Mhm.
1 or 2 years. And the second question is, I was wondering, like, completely regardless of the academics. So, do you think that postdoc or even PhD is mandatory when it comes about the industry all the time, or like at least like some experience before the methodologies or something or research would be also important in certain areas, when it comes about the bench works or like protocols at the end, like it will be mostly like how to interpret the data and how to do
Mhm.
the experiments or something. So I was wondering that kind of situation, how are things in industry?
Yeah. I'll try and tackle some of that, but if I miss a part, just remind me after I go through
Okay.
maybe my first pass. Um, so yeah, I think one theme you're hitting on is, how are there ways to kind of figure out if industry's for you or not, right? Like, are there internships or are there collaborations or stuff like that can at least get your toes in the water to figure out if it's even for you? So there are a variety of means to do that. It kind of depends on what level you're in. So, for instance, at Pfizer, there's a couple ways. If you are at a bachelor level, um, and I think even a master's sort of level, somewhere around there, they do have internships where you can get paid by Pfizer to do essentially rotations across Pfizer departments. So you get kind of a flavor of different sorts of departments and what sort of work they do, because there are numerous different types of work here. And, I'm going to have, my own perspective, but those sort of like rotations can give you exposure to help you figure out, okay, well, do I like industry at all? And if I do, is it in a particular department or way of doing work here? And so Pfizer and I think other companies have those opportunities. And those rotations, as far as I understand, can last as long as a year or more. I think maybe up to 2 years or something like that. But so that sort of opportunity exists. They're kind of tough to get, but they do exist. Another opportunity is if you're thinking about doing this sort of survey at like a post PhD level, then or even MD PhD or around that realm, you can do postdocs in industry. The advantage of doing the postdoc in industry is that for the most part, it's going to feel like an academic postdoc. So, like at least at Pfizer's postdoc program, and at least the postdocs I have, they are doing very basic science stuff that isn't related to the portfolio drug development. And that's because we want them to publish. We don't want them to be slowed down by like IP and legal stuff to prevent them from publishing, because we know that that material is important to show that they have been successful at this phase in their career or their training. So you will publish. That is the main goal. And it's on an accelerated timeline. So like our PhD or postdoc programs, we try and like get people out at by default at 2 years. It's usually 3 years, but we try to move pretty quickly with a somewhat formulated project that's kind of defined at the get-go, so they can have that good chance of success in meeting those timelines. So during that span, they hopefully the goal is to have them have publications. So at the end of the day, if they decide not to do industry, then they have that material and could go back to academia and say, hey, I was still successful. I still gained experience in this field and published here, and I want to go back to that sort of pool of careers. But if you do like industry, then it's still good, because during that time, industry employers will know, oh, they spent 2 to 3 years in industry, so they've at least looked through the front door of, they look through the glass of the candy shop and understand maybe how it works a little more. So they'll be a little more competitive than somebody who's coming straight from academia. So it has some flexibility at that level as well. Once you get beyond that, though, I think there's limited ability to really just survey in these sort of arenas. So maybe that was a little long, but those are at least some examples in which you can actually get some exposure to industry without maybe overcommitting. But at the end of the day, if you do sign up for a full-time job in industry for only a couple of years and want to go back to academia, I've seen people do that too. That's another way to do it. It's just, it's a little more of a commitment than maybe those other ones that obviously have a end date in mind. So sorry for the second part. Yeah, can you remind me what that was?
My second question was kind of like, is there an option in industry to do some of our research within our PhD program to, some kind of collaboration or something, if you're into kind of like industry, to like 1 year, think about as a 1 year internship or something, to go there,
Yep.
also kind of like intern, but also continue our experiments, and also like getting familiar with the industry environment, how the dynamics are, kind of like that. Is there a kind of opportunity in industry in general, like companies or something?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So industry, definitely in Pfizer in particular, we do external collaborations, but it's really on a need basis. So like, let's say we want to, what could be a good example? Let's say that there's a particular type of tumor that we're interested in making a drug in, but we really don't have strong expertise in house, but we really want to get in there. So, how can we supplement our expertise for something we really don't have internally? Well, we can go externally to the key opinion leaders in that field or that type of, let's say, cancer, and create a scenario where we essentially create a grant for like 3 or 4 years to do specific types of research in that area. So we as Pfizer can learn more about that area from the key opinion leader or like an academic PI. And, it's just kind of a mutualistic sort of relationship where they get funding to participate. And there's probably details worked out that can allow that individual or a PI to publish on some part of that research. So during that process, you'd imagine postdocs and grad students may be involved in that as well. And so they could have the fringe benefit of just being exposed to that sort of interaction and kind of understanding maybe the way Pfizer or some drug development company thinks about research and how they do research, which is pretty different in a lot of ways than when academics do. But that's another one, but it's not one that's necessarily like easy to sign up for. It's kind of driven from internal Pfizer folk and saying there's a problem we want to address, and we're going to do it by making a collaboration with this particular group. So yeah, that's unfortunately kind of the reverse direction, I think, of what you're hoping for. But I think through the internships and postdocs, that's probably going to be a better, well, two things. One, that's one you could probably apply for from an external perspective. And also, you're probably going to get a lot more experience and understanding for what industry is if you do that as opposed to something that's pretty remote and the company's just trying to really build on or answer questions that they want to, if that makes sense. I hope it does. But if you
Yeah,
have questions, let me know. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yep.
I have a follow-up question with
Yep.
your postdoc thing that you mentioned. So, do you have to come up with your own proposal when you enter an industry postdoc, or you usually follow what is already going on in the pipeline, and you do not write a project proposal as we do in academia?
It's a good question. So each company, I think, does it differently. And that's something to keep in mind too. And if you look around for industry postdocs, there are a lot of different flavors. Some of them are kind of like long interviews, or like essentially if you hang out long enough and you get along with people at the end of the day, then they may offer you a job. I would say that is not common, but that there is that opportunity out there. Some people are very blunt about it. For instance, Regeneron in New York used to do that, at least pretty much do that. Um, but Pfizer and Genentech and other companies, for the most part, don't promise anything at the end of the day. They want you to go and be successful somewhere else. The whole point is to train you. So yeah, if you go back to your question at the root of, or at the start of the postdoc, are you required to come up with a project? Yes and no. So I think because we want postdocs to come in and out within 2 to 3 years, there isn't much time to waste, basically. So the project is probably 70 or 80% worked out before you potentially onboarding to start it. But you'll have to fill in the blanks for the missing 20% or whatever and actually write it up. So at Pfizer, there actually is a process in the first 3 months. We'll actually write, it's pretty short, but it's like a 5 to 10 page document that will outline basic background of the biology you want to tackle. And here, maybe a couple aims of work you're going to do and how you're going to do it to address those things within a 2 to 3 year timeline. So we'll hammer that out by the end of 3 months. And then after 3 months, you execute on that plan. So yeah, I can see how people kind of maybe don't like that aspect, but I think it's mostly in the interest of the trainee and time to just make sure you're not getting past the point of return by staying 5, 6 years where we don't think there's any benefit to doing that. That's another sort of cultural difference, I think, between industry and academia. So yeah, it's usually like that. But again, each company is going to have maybe a slightly different flavor of what the postdoc expectations are. Good question, though.
Other questions for Gabe?
Can go for another, if that's
Yeah, go
fine.
ahead. Yeah,
So
yeah,
it
yeah.
might sound very vague, but as a grad
Mhm.
student planning to switch to industry, I'm just confused that is it easier to get a job as a postdoc in industry, or it's easier to enter as a scientist? It's pretty broad question.
Yeah, yeah. I think yeah with yeah, it just depends, unfortunately. So I think like it's all about opportunity. I think that's it's kind of a key theme in industry and probably in academia as well, some ways, especially like if you want to look for a tenure track position, right? Sometimes they're just not there. So you got to do another round of searching um, over the next year. So it's kind of like that, right? So like you can imagine a possibility where there is an opening for a scientist role that you could easily compete for and you could start in. So you could get that, and there just may not be PhD level ones at the time that you're looking, right? And it just may take you a long time to find one. So it just depends on on what's being presented to you at the time. I would say related to that though, that there's kind of two different paths in industry. One, you maybe start as early as you can, right out of bachelor's, and you don't have a PhD, and maybe you have a master's too, but you just don't have a PhD. Versus ones that start after individuals get a PhD. The trajectories are a little different because if you do have a PhD, people know that you went through some pain and suffering to learn how to do basic research, to make a scientific story, and have intense training to really round you out within a basic discovery sense. So maybe, as you onboard into industry, doing that won't be as hard as compared to somebody who hasn't gone through a PhD process because they just haven't had that experience. So industry folk, I think, often associate non-PhD level folk with, thinking they're going to have to learn how to do that with time. It's just going to take experience and time, and that may be longer than a PhD process, right? Just depending on what opportunities that present themselves as they're within industry. And so I think people really, and people can go way up the ladder without a PhD. It's not like there's a glass ceiling or something, but I think it's easier to accept folks to have a good basic research discovery background if they have a PhD already because they've already met, some universities criteria for like having good research stuff. So I think it gives you an advantage in a career trajectory because you've already overcome that big hurdle. And it's just a matter of you getting used to doing industry research and figuring out ways to propel yourself up the ladder career wise. So I think it's just a little slower if you start non PhD. It's just the way I see it played out so far than if you have a PhD. So I would say that's kind of it's not directly related to your question, but it kind of is. Um, I know yours is more about opportunity, but I think yeah, I at least related to that. That's how I see it play out.
Yeah. And along the same lines, when you join an industry as a postdoc, do you have to sign a bond or a contract that you have to stay as a postdoc for this limit of time, like for example, 2 years, or you can still switch, suppose within the same company, or if you find an opportunity outside that company as a scientist, which is giving you a better opportunity, there's no rule that you have to stay for this particular amount of time.
No, no one's a slave. No one is like chained to the desk or anything like that. Um, I think it's usually how it's set up is a postdoc will, for the most part, unless they're like from the same town, but if they're not from here, then Pfizer or some other company will likely give you some money to move so you can pay for expenses and maybe even have a signing bonus. If you're competitive, like if Pfizer wants to compete with some other postdoc offer you've got from Novartis or I don't know, somewhere else, um, then they'll give you a little bit of money, basically. So that pile of money, which is not big, by the way, um, that money can be used within the contract you sign. So the contract you sign is just saying, I'm going to come to Pfizer or wherever. And me signing this says I'll accept the money, and if I leave by if I stay more than 2 years or more than a year or something like that, then I get to keep all that moving expenses and whatever money. But if I fall short of that and I leave 3 months or 6 months after joining, I will forfeit that money and return it. So it's not that you can't leave, you can, but like some of these incentives to get you to come there may have to be returned. And that's pretty typical for any job in industry. They just don't want people like using them to like move to San Diego. Basically, they want to make sure you're at least like contributing for the role you signed up for. Um, but to that point, if you are here, for instance, for 6 months and you find this great opportunity just down the road at a company for a full time position, then you can go, right? I mean, technically, you could probably even like for that new role say, "Hey, I got to pay back X number of dollars. Can you like give my signing bonus this supplement so then I can pay it back to Pfizer and it won't be a burden to me?" And so that totally happens all the time. And so at the end of the day, no, you're not like in prison here to like never leave based on the contract you sign. You're definitely free to go. It's just you might be at some disadvantages depending on what your route out is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And just one last question. For
Mhm.
the postdocs, is your salary usually fixed, or if you work overtime, you get like extra pay as opposed to, I think, for scientists, if you are working overtime, you get some extra pay?
Yeah, so all full time employees here are salaried, so there's no overtime,
Okay.
um, and that's true for postdocs too. And then when the postdoc gets an offer and the hiring manager has to come up with a dollar amount, they are for the postdocs, it's a much more narrow range for how much they can move that. Because to be honest, to Pfizer, I mean, I think they do like having postdocs in here to help bring in new perspectives on basic biology and drive new discoveries. So there is interest in that, but the real utility in drug discovery is quite low because they are not working on any portfolio programs or anything like that for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So because of that, they're compensated just enough for what their purpose is. And in that salary range as a consequence, it's just fairly narrow. There isn't much wiggle room there. Um, and so, yeah, there could be a little bit, but it usually has to be driven by competition. There has to be some other offer that is clearly better and that we want to match or something that's at least within an acceptable range. So, yeah, that's typically how it works.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Any other questions for Gabe? Okay, I'll wrap up with one final one, but first, just want
Sure.
to put a plug in that Gabe has been invited to be a part of the Holden Research Seminar Series in the next academic year. So he will be our June 11th, 2025 speaker. So I know that's a ways off, but just look for that next June. There'll be an announcement coming out, and he's got some cool new science that his team is working on. At that point, he can share publicly and share with you all. And you might be one of the first to hear about it in June. And
Yeah,
he'll have a new baby then, so maybe he'll throw up a cute picture of the new baby too. So,
most
um,
definitely.
yeah, so June 11th. And also, we will, as part of his visit here, we'll have a lunch with trainees. So if you are interested in doing lunch with Gabe that day, feel free to shoot me an email or Amy Candelero an email, who is on this call today. She coordinates our seminar series, and we will get you signed up on that lunch with Gabe. So last question, Gabe, is often one that trainees are curious about but scared to ask, so I will ask. What does
Mhm.
work-life balance look like for you in this type of position and industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, For me, it's good. I'm working at least like logging into the computer. I will log in typically 8 a.m. to about 4 p.m. Um, so about 8 hours usually of work. Um, I would say too, though, that depending on the scenario, like if there's some document that's due or a PowerPoint presentation, that's another thing I forgot to say. I make a lot of presentations. That's like 50-60% of my work is helping do that or do it myself. But if there's some deadline coming up, I'll be working more than that just to make sure I'm hitting that deadline and coordinating with teams in the right way. But I would say on average, yeah, I'm pretty much doing 8 or 9 hours a day, and only working 5 days a week. Um, I think, when you get to this level too, I mean, your brain sometimes doesn't turn off. So I would say sometimes you are always doing a little bit of work if you're thinking about some problem you haven't quite figured out tackling. But it is a different sort of balance compared to what you might see in academia, where I think a lot of people work weekends and work hard to get those grants. And it makes sense. But yeah, it's different than that.
Very good. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. And hope
Yeah, thank
you
you.
all have a great rest of your week. Thanks. Oh, please give Gabe a round of applause.
Oh,
Yep.
thank
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Megan. Have a good one.